young men find a skeleton in the Columbia River. Police investigate murder until they find a Stone Age spear point buried in its hip. He's 9,000 years old, one of the first Americans ever found. Now follow researchers as they bring Kennewick Man back to life. And find out how he's forever changing our notion of who were the first Americans. The remarkable story of Kennewick Man, next on Discover Magazine. Two young men take a shortcut along the Columbia River. Here, near Kennewick, Washington, they will stumble upon a discovery that will rewrite the history books and launch a 3-year legal battle.
I saw what I thought was a rock. The top of it, what I saw was pretty round. And then after I picked it up, obviously, I saw the teeth. I wasn't sure if by holding this I was getting like pieces of rotting meat or whatnot. We couldn't see it. It was kind of, we were kind of holding. I didn't want to touch the under part of it.
I thought for sure it had to have been some kind of drowning or murder victim from at least, a year or two.
Little did they know, this skull would take us thousands of years back in time and forever change our notion of who were the first Americans. The discovery of the skull leads local police to launch an investigation. It may be a body unaccounted for, a suicide or murder still unsolved. It's also not unusual to find Native American skeletons washed in from traditional burial grounds. Until police know for sure, they treat this as a crime scene.
So we're going to go in and see if there's any bones, and it may be just going by feel and feeling to see what we can find.
The river is murky, and visibility is poor. They hit bottom and work their way forward, going by feel. Soon they're working on their knees. Buried in the muck, they find pieces of the skeleton. They leave them in place so as not to disturb the crime scene. In the meantime, the coroner brings the skull to forensic anthropologist Jim Chatters.
This is a first glance, so I don't have a sense of time on him. All I have is just his physical features to work with. The bone was in very good condition, good and sound, and didn't show a lot of weathering or dissolution or anything, so it appeared to be relatively young because of that. Very long, narrow brain case, fairly distinct brow, and a nose that just jumps off his face. Very pronounced nose. These are all characteristics more often see on Western Eurasian skeletons, European skeletons.
The skull appears European, not Native American, and shows signs of being a few hundred years old. Jim Chatters believes they have found the skull of an early 19th century settler. The police call off the criminal investigation, and Chatters collects the bones. Chatters cannot fathom the importance of this discovery. It will turn out to be a settler like no other. The first clue is in the pelvis.
What you can see from the pelvis when we found it is it has a very narrow notch behind the socket for the thigh bone, and that narrow notch is indicative of the male.
Chatters will come to call this male Kennewick Man. Over 10 trips, he will collect over 350 bone fragments, about 70% of the skeleton. Only the smaller bones remain missing. Now Chatters will let the bones speak. He estimates Kennewick Man's age at around 45 years old. He measures the femur. It's a bone which varies regularly with height. At 470 millimeters, it translates to a height of 5 feet, 8 inches.
The diameter of the ball joint varies in proportion to weight. So you take the measurement. Kennewick Man's was 49 millimeters across this measurement, and that corresponds to a weight of approximately 160 pounds.
As he looks at the bones closely, he finds signs of an extremely rough and difficult life.
Kennewick Man had been injured extensively. Among the injuries was a fracture in his ribs right through the center of his chest. It broke the ribs away right across both sides of his sternum, and some of them never healed back together, so they kind of caved in and out when he breathed.
Then Chatters sees something strange and bizarre embedded in the pelvis. Chatters takes the pelvis to Kennewick General Hospital. He begins with a standard X-ray. The X-ray will show if the object embedded in the pelvis is made of metal, like a bullet or knife blade. But whatever is lodged in the bone is invisible to X-rays. It's clearly not made of metal. The mystery deepens. He tries a CAT scan next. The CAT scan will take images of the pelvis from many different angles, revealing anything from stone to plastic.
Let's see what we got.
Jim Chatters gets the surprise of his life. Buried in what he assumed was a 19th century settler, he finds an ancient spear point.
Okay. And this base of the point here, sharp, clear, serrated or saw-toothed edge that's characteristic of what we call a cascade point, which is a style that was most commonly used between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago.
The spear point cutting through bone and muscle left Kennewick Man in lifelong pain. Chatters is baffled. What is a 19th century settler doing with a Stone Age spear point in his hip? The answer may forever change archaeology. Next, Kennewick Man reveals a 9,000-year-old mystery. This program... Jim Chatters sends a small bone for radiocarbon dating, hoping to solve the mystery of Kennewick Man. A chemist crushes the bone and begins the process of analyzing an isotope called carbon-14. All living organisms contain carbon-14. But at death, this isotope begins to decay at a steady rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 is left, the lab can determine the age. Kennewick Man's age is nothing less than mind-boggling. He is over 9,000 years old, a man who lived before 7,000 BC, and one of the oldest and most complete Americans ever found. oldest and most complete Americans ever found. And yet, Kennewick Man is a puzzle. Scientists have long believed that the first and oldest Americans were Native Americans. But with his unusual features, Kennewick Man doesn't look like a Native American.
Well, the best way to characterize this is that for most of my career of more than 30 years, I had been following in the tracks of someone, and I thought I knew who I was following. And then finally, with Kennewick Man, I caught up with him, and he turned around, and he wasn't who I expected him to be.
The traditional theory of the peopling of the Americas begins during the last ice age, when a land bridge opens up between Siberia and Alaska. A group of people leave Asia, walk across the land bridge, and settle the Americas. It was long thought that these people were the ancestors of today's Native Americans. Kennewick Man may overturn this long-held scientific belief. But this hastily made video is the last Jim Chatters ever sees of his remarkable discovery. For only 4 days after the radiocarbon date, the skeleton is confiscated by the government. All scientific work stops, as 5 local Native American tribes claim the 9,000-year-old skeleton as their ancestor.
When the coroner came to get the bones, actually he called me and says, "Hey buddy, I gotta come get the bones." And I just virtually panicked. I felt that I had not had time yet and really wasn't equipped to gather all the information that a skeleton of this import required. So I felt I'd failed posterity. It was a pretty tough time.
Native American burials are one of the most controversial issues in archaeology. It's a controversy that goes back to 1868, when the Surgeon General orders the Army to collect Native American skulls. At the time, it is to study the latest theories linking racial superiority to skull shape.
And basically, the United States Army did, for a long while, routinely collect Indian heads. I mean, they were something that they just went out, if you got a dead Indian, collect the skull, it's worth a few bucks. Send it back. There's a bounty on it.
Over the next 150 years, scientific theories change, but the collection of skeletons continues, deeply offending the Native American respect for the dead.
And I've seen Native Americans physically sick just at the thought of experiencing human burials. The Native Americans have strong religious beliefs about graves and burials and human remains, and it's a strength of feeling that most just can't understand.
By 1990, there were up to 200,000 Native American skeletons in U.S. collections. In response, Congress passes NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Under this law, tribes can claim any skeleton over 500 years old as their ancestor, including Kennewick Man. They have not just a legal claim, but a scientific one. For here where Kennewick Man once roamed, researchers have traced an oral and archaeological history back thousands of years, back to a time before humans may have differentiated into the races we see today. To many scientists, 9,000 years of evolution could transform Kennewick Man's descendants into today's Native Americans. Now local tribes plan to honor their respect for the dead and rebury their ancestor.
Under the federal law, if it's Native American, then we go into repatriation with our kind of responsibility that they have to make sure that this individual is laid to rest and can make his journey back to his reward. That's what the Indian people are interested in.
What's going to happen to the skeleton if it's turned over to the tribes? It'll go in the ground. It'll go in the ground it didn't come out of. What that means very quickly is it will deteriorate and it will disappear. What happens in the next generation when 15 or 20 new methods come up that allow us to ask additional questions? We won't have that material then.
The federal government begins taking the legal steps to repatriate Kennewick Man. But then, 8 leading anthropologists sue. They claim local tribes, even using today's DNA analysis, cannot trace their ancestry directly back to Kennewick Man. Coming up, a radical new theory about how we populated the Americas.
Honey, I'm going.
Richard Jantz is a skull expert and one of the leaders of the Kennewick Man lawsuit. Jantz has examined most of the ancient skulls found in the Americas, those 8,000 years or older. With each ancient skull, he takes over 70 different measurements and compares them to his database of 4,000 skulls from around the world. Just like Kennewick Man, most of the oldest skulls look nothing like today's Native Americans.
They tend to be more similar to Old World populations, such as Polynesians or Japanese or South Asians, or in some cases even Europeans. So the picture that develops from the early crania is a complex one, and one that we don't fully understand.
Jantz has a radical theory. None of these ancient skulls are Native American. He believes Native Americans migrated from Asia years later. Instead, the ancient skulls may represent 3 or even more earlier immigrant groups. It's a revolutionary idea. Long before Ellis Island, America may have had a multitude of immigrants. A startling new theory arises. The Bering Land Bridge might not be the only path to America. Now it's possible that before modern navigation, an ancient people may have used small skin boats to skirt the Ice Age glaciers and settle the shoreline of the Americas. But what happened to all the different immigrant groups? The answer may lie in Kennewick Man's hip. Perhaps they were driven out in a violent conflict. Native Americans may not have been the first, but the survivors. Kennewick Man is raising startling questions, but Jim Chatters is left with only one way to study him. Working with sculptor Tom McClelland, he's making a cast of Kennewick Man's skull.
Made a mother mold.
What emerges is an almost exact replica. Now they will bring Kennewick Man back to life. Using clues from the skull, they will reconstruct what he may have looked like 9,000 years ago.
Across from 19.
Chatters begins by adding 32 markers to indicate how thick the muscles should be. The markers are based on studies from cadavers and CT scans. Soon he notices a clue. Kennewick Man held an expression so tightly and so often, it has been ground into his skull.
Well, the muscles attach to the bone's surface, and as they're used over and over again for decades, they build up a little bit of a bony spur. The muscles that he's used most heavily are showing up here, here, and right up there. And they're the ones that pull up the corner of the mouth this way and the point of the chin like that. So this is what you do when you're just enduring something very unpleasant.
For a muscle to kind of get a rough shape.
Now they will construct the muscles of the face and carefully place them in position. In this case, they won't add much fat. Kennewick Man was in ill health and probably had a lean face.
We've added more than 20 of the major muscles of the face, the ones that give it most of its expression. We've also added the massive muscles of the neck. And as you can see, it already begins to take on the form of a human being.
Next, they add the skin, covering all the muscles. And they age him. They add the years of living with the pain of a crushed chest and a spear point embedded in his hip.
I have to go back and work him down.
Oh, really, he probably was pretty...
They add the effects of the harsh, dry environment.
Sure.
The creases and lines as the aging skin becomes less resilient.
Because of the harshness of the environment, because of the pain, this individual tended to age quite a bit faster than we tend to do in modern culture today. So we figured that this fellow would probably look something like, say, a rancher that worked outside a lot, maybe at the age of his late 50s, maybe.
After 9,000 years, Kennewick Man emerges. Is he Native American, European, or simply human?
And then I finally just sort of went like this and turned him toward me and was just so close that I was face to face, and I was struck by how very strongly human he was. It's a reminder that Kennewick Man was a human being, and he had his own desires, his own likes and dislikes, and his own obvious difficulties with his fellow human beings. And in those ways, he was very much like the rest of us.
Today, the legal battle over Kennewick Man continues. Scientists want to study one of the most precious finds in the Americas, while Native Americans have a religious and legal right to rebury their ancestors. The outcome: Kennewick Man is already rewriting the settling of the Americas. America, it seems, was always a land of immigrants.